When I started this series of Let's Get You Into videos almost 3 years ago, the point was always to provide a guide to discographies that are particularly difficult in one way or another. That could mean musically difficult and inaccessible, that could mean artists with a ton of releases where you would need guidance of which among like dozens you should pick from. It could mean artists with a variety of sounds across different eras of their career, or it could mean artists with a lot of aliases where you might not know entirely what music they've made. Today, in what is probably my most ambitious project for this series yet, I'm tackling a band who meets every one of those criteria. A band whose musical output ranges in sound from difficult to borderline abusive, who have dozens of releases across multiple sonic eras and several projects. Today, I want to talk about the band Swans. This has been a project I've been both anticipating and dreading since I started my channel. It's a video I know I'm prepared for, and it lines up somewhat with a big new album announcement, so the time is definitely right, but I'm still incredibly intimidated. I'm intimidated, I think, mostly for the same reasons a newcomer to the band would be, because of the sheer breadth and scope of this project. Everything about this band is complicated, be it the makeup of members and lineup shifts throughout the years, the variety and just how sonically disparate much of their material is from each other, the various side projects that are themselves an inextricable part of the Swans canon, and all of that is without even mentioning the music itself. Every single Swans album is dense, multifaceted, and essential to understanding the trajectory of the band, and, even more terrifyingly, many of these albums are incredibly long. Many, arguably even most, of the band's most essential releases crack the 2-hour mark, and practically none of these runtimes are filler either, which means I have hours upon hours of material to work through and analyze and discuss here. This will, no doubt, be the longest video of this series, and possibly the longest video on my entire channel up to this point, and that simultaneously terrifies and emboldens me. This is a project I've been building myself up to for years, and I'm finally ready to take the shot. I only get one chance at this, so let's make it count. Let's get you into Swans. So, before we get to the music, there's a fair bit of groundwork we need to lay out first. Swans are a band that was formed by Michael Gira in 1982 at the peak of the short-lived no-wave scene that was prevalent in the New York underground music scene at the time. No-wave took the genre of hardcore punk and essentially threw away any semblance of melody, instead focusing on angular rhythms, noise, and general aggression and brutality. For some other good examples of this sound, you can listen to the Eno-produced No New York compilation, or any of the first 3 Sonic Youth albums. Those ones in particular are pretty apt comparisons because Thurston Moore, the guitarist, was a founding member of Swans. He never recorded an album with them, but it's pretty obvious that his involvement in the earliest years of the band were essential to their developing sound and aesthetics. I won't be able to note all the members that have come and gone throughout the years, but there's a very in-depth and informative chart on Wikipedia which notes every member, their role in the band, and how long they were there. Michael Gira is the only constant through every iteration of the project. Things started to change when the other most well-known member of Swans joined, that being second vocalist Jarboe. While by no means girly or soft in demeanor, her inclusion definitely influenced the band's trajectory into its more atmospheric and gothic era. This sound grew and morphed over time into what seemed to be an unkillable monster, releasing some of the most groundbreaking and legendary gothic and post-rock albums of the 90s before collapsing into itself as the band deformed near the end of the decade. After giving its grand farewell, the monster of Swans lay dormant for over a decade, as members went to work on some of their own projects, which we'll talk about later. To fans of the project, it seemed like this would be the end of Swans, and while it had inarguably ended on a high note, it was hard not to wonder what kind of sounds we would hear from them in the new millennium. Those questions were answered in 2010 when Gira brought in collaborators new and old to revive the Swans moniker for a new century. This decade saw Swans reclaiming the same ethos and approach to music making that made them such a standout project in the past, but with a very different sound. Far more rhythmic and focused on crescendos and post-rock passages, this iteration reached its peak between 2012 and 2016 with the release of The Trilogy, a set of albums that would be just as definitive of the band's sound as their older releases were, if not more. Since then, we've had 2 more albums, including The Beggar, which released a little under a year ago, which sees the group in something of a transitional period. Whether that's a transition from one era to the next or out of existence altogether was a bit of a hot debate. We'll talk about that later. And so, with that timeline laid out before us, there's a few ways we could tackle this. Some people swear by chronological, which, for fans of really, really heavy experimental music, could certainly work, but to most, I think this is a risky way to go, as many will feel alienated by the intentionally abrasive and violent sounds of the no-wave era. Another is to pick and choose based on what is most highly acclaimed, and while this is certainly a better approach than the first one I mentioned, I feel the urge to push back against this, as I feel like many of the band's best works are heavily in conversation with other works that come before and after. What I've settled on is my attempt to give a smooth entry into the band while still leaving some surprises for later on as you become more familiar with the project. If I have one piece of advice before we get started, it's to take your time with this one. I'm going to be including extensive timestamps in the description, and this video isn't going anywhere, so if this truly is your introduction to the band's music, give each record the time it needs to process and unfold. I promise that it's worth it. With possibly the longest intro I've ever done out of the way, let's do this. Here are the records I would recommend you use to get started on your Swans journey. So as you probably just saw, I've given you 2 options for how to start your journey. You can either start with the more gothic 80s and 90s material from their older lineup, or you can jump forward and dive straight into the post-rock trilogy. If either one you pick first doesn't click with you right away, just go check out the other one and come back. Like I said, this video isn't going anywhere, so take your time and find the approach that best suits your taste going into this. To start, let's talk about the band's first foray into gothic territory, with 1987's Children of God. I chose this record as a pre-hiatus starting point because of all of their material, I think this one gives listeners the most complete view of what Swans was in its totality in the 80s and 90s. Right from the jump, we're slammed by the band's signature no-wave style with aggressive satirization of organized Christianity in the lyrics and the same brutal rhythms that we'll be getting more familiar with as we go further back. But here, we can see an atmosphere that didn't exist before. Behind the brutality, there is a dark beauty in the keys and production choices, and that dark beauty becomes a far more pronounced serenity in the following track, In My Garden. This marks Jarbo's debut as a lead vocalist and a massive statement as to the direction this band would proceed in. The clean guitar and sweeping atmosphere backdrops Jarbo's off-kilter cooing. In contrast to the first track, it's hard not to get the sense that a story is being told here, and it's one of the most visual tracks in the band's career. The no-wave instrumental styles return on the track Sex, God, Sex, but in place of violence and aggression is a horrifying sense of cult-like religiosity. Wailing choirs backdrop massive plodding drums and slowly ascending and descending guitar tones, as Jura plays the role of a manic preacher before a mass of the vulnerable and dejected. He spews words of divinity with the conviction of a cult leader desperate to maintain power. By this point, the lyrical theme of the record comes into crystalline focus, and with the next track, the sonics begin to come into the same amount of focus, with sweeping strings and chorals underpinning Jarbo's pastoral recitation of what feels like scripture, washing over you in an unintelligible wave of deadpan religious gospel. This is in perfect contrast to the following track, Like a Drug, which, while it's probably not the heaviest track the band ever did technically, in contrast to what directly precedes it, it feels like taking a brick to the face, and then another, and another. The undertones of religious violence and ostracization were there implicitly before, but here they become unignorable as the atonal, almost mechanical throbs of bass pierce your skull, and Jarrah continues his preaching. It's intoxicating by this point. Like a drug. Cool in your mouth, in your hands, in your belly, in your mind. The cult backing him delivers these horrifying off-kilter shalalas as the guitars become more angular and brass instruments begin to aggressively debut. The tone has been set, and now the back half of the record can begin. To call this album biblical would be a pretty blatantly obvious comment, but in particular, the harsh directness of the themes and music here remind me heavily of the Old Testament, where God is seen as an unforgiving force that his subjects sit in abject fear of, which drives them to do horrible and unconscionable things in hopes to appease a force that they cannot understand nor hope to. Beautiful Child is this feeling in its purest form. Jarrah gives his most violent and crazed vocal performance of perhaps his entire career, detailing the sacrifice of an infant child to God in hopes to escape his own damnation. The keys and choirs are cruel and unyielding as a nearly industrial rhythm crashes over and over on loop. It feels like watching an actual ritual take place, scared to look away for fear that you will be the next one to go if you look out of place. Speaking of out of place, the tonal whiplash from Beautiful Child to Blackmail is one of the most perfect uses of emotional manipulation the band has ever pulled off. By contrasting the most horrific and cruel track to the most beautiful, where Jarboe sings isolated over a single piano, there's a feeling of consolation, like, that was horrifying, but we went through it together, we're okay now. This is classic cult tactics to force newcomers into an emotional bond with other members, and to see it so perfectly represented in music is nothing short of incredible. The following Trust Me portrays the consequences of this built-up trust, and even the vagueness of the lyrics can't obscure the fact that this is clearly a religious leader abusing their power over his subjects. The song never details what that abuse entails, but it's not hard to imagine. From this point onwards, the cycle is essentially complete, as the subject has completely given themselves up to what feels to them like an inescapable force. The music becomes much more hypnotic, and the aggression subsides into more folksy Americana instrumentation, like the acoustic guitars and harmonica on Real Love. Blind Love is just as hypnotic, but for opposite reasons, as the sparseness of its first half builds anxiety leading up to its explosions in the back half. As the rhythms return, with Jarrah speaking solo over them, there's an obvious darkness and aggression here, but in comparison to the violence of the earlier tracks, this feels almost tame, like the subject is accustomed to this and handles it with more undue grace than they would have before. The title track closes us out with the most cultish sound of them all, as an uncharacteristically clean and precise rhythm underpins a church organ, which Jarboe vocalizes over, often multiple times at once. We are children, children of God. The choir repeats for minutes on end as a single distorted guitar chord builds up the soundscape. I was using the word hypnotic before, but here the effect is almost dizzying. There is no escape. I've spilled a lot of ink today writing about this album and why I believe it's the best starting point for getting into the band pre-hiatus, and I hope that at least some of my praises ring true for newcomers following this guide. But even if it doesn't click for you right away, do come back to this one down the road. Like I said earlier, context is key for every Swans record, and while I picked this one as a starting point because I think it provides the maximum amount of context for where the band's sound had been and would go in the future, there's a lot of stuff that is left out simply by nature of the constant evolution of this band. If nothing else, this is a record that deserves primary attention in the long and illustrious career for being a prime example of their artistic merit, and I hope I've helped shine some light on that. From here, we jump forward a good few years to 1995's The Great Annihilator, an album which, of all their pre-hiatus material, is probably their most generally accessible. Far less conceptually direct than Children of God, This is instead a lot more focused on individual tracks and moments, as well as building its mood through more lush and post-punk adjacent instrumentation. This record is much less aggressive than a lot of their oldest material, but more so than the preceding folk albums, which we'll talk more about soon. This acts as the best blend of all of their material from Children of God onwards, and an exciting look forwards to Soundtracks for the Blind. The Gread Annihilator sees Michael Gira actually singing far more than previously, and singing quite well, I would add. He's obviously still got the super low drone to his voice that is pretty much unavoidable, but there's a lot more melody to it, and that really helps these songs stand on their own a lot better. Compared to some of the sparser and more immediate compositions of Children of God, one of the first things you'll notice here is that the soundscapes are far more lush and warm. Very rarely is a single musical element taking the forefront as wholly as the bass or drums often did previously. A lot of the individual instruments and sounds on this record are very cyclical, repeating simple elements over and over. What makes it work so perfectly is that those repetitions aren't often in sync with each other, and you get these really lavish backdrops that don't quite verge into post-rock the way we'll be seeing soon, but definitely give a lot of indication that that's the direction that they were steering towards. Something you'll also probably notice is the kind of role switch that Gira and Jarboe have undergone here, where previously Jarboe was the softer release from Gira's intensity. Instead here, she is absolutely crazed, and Gira is the more cerebral, measured half of the duo. The best example of this is the difference between Jarboe's track, Mother Father, and Gira's stripped back track, Blood Promise, which immediately follows. Jarboe delivers one of the most emotionally draining performances in the whole band's career, and then Gira comes in a track later, pensive and thoughtful in one of the most beautiful tracks on the record. They come together on the next track, Mind, Body, Light, Sound, with Gira on lead and Jarboe delivering some beautiful choral backings. It's the best track on the record, and a major part of it is the clear vocal chemistry between the two singers. I briefly mentioned the post-punk influences on this thing earlier, but as my taste in music has grown and I've listened to more stuff in that genre, it's very obvious to me where the influences here lie. At times it's akin to The Chameleons, I hear The Cure's Disintegration in a couple parts of the back half, but the biggest and most obvious influence is Bauhaus. The first couple of tracks in particular sound exactly like them and their side project Love and Rockets. A slight hint at their more industrial roots makes an appearance as well in the track Alcohol the Seed, where these super aggressive drums cycle under shimmering harpsichord and guitars. On the following Killing for Company, we see both the most post-punk feeling track as well as somehow the greatest indication of what Soundtracks for the Blind would be in its highest moments. The track slowly crawls through its 7-minute runtime, slowly building and evolving but never escaping its core root elements. The bass sounds especially post-punk, and the whole track is produced in such a simple yet lush way that it almost feels psychedelic. Intoxicating is a word that I anticipate using a lot in this video, but it's because there's very little else I could call the experience of listening to a Swans record for your first, third, or 30th time. There's nothing quite so enrapturing, in my opinion. This is not a band you go to for happy music. I hope I've made that much clear already, but I think this is one of the most subtly depressed and somber records the band has done, certainly up to the point of its release, at least. It feels almost dejected in its inability or refusal to really explode into rage or joy. I used to see that as a weakness, the way this record maintains a single mood throughout, but as time has gone on, I've grown much warmer on this record, and I find the way that it plays with faster, less downtrodden tempos, as well as its more prominent use of Sonic Youth-style guitars, to be far more emotionally stimulating than if they'd made something more extreme or experimental. Not even to say that this isn't experimental, of course, it is. It's nearly impossible to properly categorize, but it's playing in the realms more often associated with accessibility, and that makes it even more unsettling. Which of these two older records you gravitate more towards is a pretty good indicator of which of the two main eras you'll get more out of. If you gravitate more towards the intensity of Children of God, you'll probably love their No Wave era. If you prefer the lush and intricate beauty of the Gread Annihilator, then their folkier and more gothic era will certainly appeal to you. Whatever your preference, there is a third option that I've yet to discuss, a lumbering behemoth completely disconnected from this older material. Whether you failed to connect with these two records or passed with flying colors, we still have to talk about the Trilogy. I struggled with what to do in regards to what is arguably the most famous thing about Swans, that being their trilogy of albums from 2012 to 2016. These albums saw the band redefining their sound for a new millennium. No longer on the cutting edge of post-rock, it would have been foolish to retread the ground they'd paved before their hiatus, so instead, Swans did what they do best, bringing brand new levels of experimentation to a genre that otherwise threatened to grow stale. It's a bit of a hard ask for a newcomer to any band to dive headfirst into an epic saga told across 3 albums, all of which crack the 2-hour mark, but I also couldn't justify splitting the 3 apart, as they are all intimately linked in a way that I hope will become obvious as we continue. You do not necessarily need to listen to these without breaks in between. You can dabble elsewhere in between records, but I highly recommend at least listening to these in the order they were released in. I promise it's worth it. There are 2 records in Swans' extensive discography that I think tell the most cohesive front-to-back stories, the kind of thing that just by listening to the record you can get a sense of plot and narrative. The first is Children of God, as we discussed earlier, and then, 25 years later, is The Seer. On physical issues of the record, there was a hype sticker that read,
"An unfolding cosmic heave of bliss, love, blood, and light. Technicolor sonic cinema for true seekers of oblivion through sound."
The Seer is a record that asks for an incredible amount of focus and concentration to completely follow the narrative it displays, but even to the untrained ear, it's pretty easy to pick up on the general plot beats through lyrical motifs and sonic explorations. It's a steady descent into madness, a reversion to beasthood, the resulting ostracization from society, and the immediate and violent consequences thereafter. It's a bit cliche of me to draw a comparison to my favorite video game here, but this is what I imagine happens in the heads of all of those werewolf grunts in Central Yharnam in Bloodborne. The music is insane to begin with, already too far gone before the music has even started, but it's nothing compared to the depths it will crawl to by the end. The narrative is what I most often think of in regards to this record, and for good reason, but what will almost certainly be most striking if you choose to listen to this after their older material is the disparity between the 2 eras of the band sonically. Bits and pieces of the sound can be heard at times, particularly in the way that the bass guitar fits prominently in the mix, but even that is heavily perverted to the point of unrecognizability. If there's one word to describe this record, it would be rhythmic, as the core of these tracks are almost unanimously the drums and the bass which cycle and repeat for sometimes dozens of minutes on end. That word from earlier in this video reveals the true tie between new and old Swans here, and that's hypnotic. It's impossible not to fall into a trance as these cyclical rhythms drone onwards into oblivion, the 2 drummers playing together to build this massive sound and the bass feeling like a thumb pressed against your temple, threatening to break through with each loop. What allows this to work is the fact that every other instrument acts as a sonic vessel that takes the listener with it to new places. The guitars scarcely play what could be called riffs. Instead, they are given the simple task of building the mix up, be it with harsh chords or even harsher feedback. Its almost unwavering use of reverb and overdrive is apocalyptic, especially in tandem with the other various instruments and sounds, a majority of which I can't even identify. This is truly one of the most massive sounding records you will ever hear, and that scale is what makes it so impactful when we see the flip side of that coin. For as loud and oppressive as this record is, there's an intimacy we see around the middle that really gives this thing the context it needs to take the big swings it does in the latter half. The Daughter Brings the Water is very similar to some of the more gothic country aesthetics that the band played with in the 90s, more on that later, and the following, Song for a Warrior, is potentially the single most beautiful song the band ever did, and it's one of the only songs they ever did prominently featuring another major artist, that being Karen O of the Yeah Yeah Yeahs. After the gargantuan title track before it, and before the cataclysmic final tracks, this brief respite is the perfect way for the record to close its first disc and open its second. And let's talk about the title track, as well as some of the other tracks in the first half I kind of glossed over before. The opening, Lunacy, displays the hypnoticism of the album instantly with a looping clean guitar and eventually the repeated chants of lunacy, lunacy, lunacy over and over. The drums and bass aren't the only cyclical aspects of the Seer, the vocals are also a major part of that. There's a lot of vocal theatrics on this record, actually, most notably the way Jura bounces around between inflections on the 32-minute title track, which sprawls and drones on between its massive concoctions of every instrument they could pull together. Bagpipes, steel cello, chimes, bassoon, it all compiles into the most gargantuan sound you're likely to have heard from the band by this point in the guide. I wouldn't necessarily blame anyone for being bored by some of the longer track length like this, especially with the use of repetition, but I think it would be pretty hard not to find anything to be excited about. If you want a track that's even more consistently explosive, look no further than the third to final track, Avatar, which, across its comparatively breezy 9 minutes, never lets up on the gas, the beast taking its own body apart piece by piece, leading itself to a bout of what feels like self-reflection on the penultimate A Piece of the Sky. There's an argument to be made that this is the best track the band has done since their hiatus, and I can't really argue with that, what with the mysterious opening campfire and drone leading up to one of the most beautiful and cathartically positive sounding bits of pure post-rock here. Lyrics don't even appear for the first 3/4 of the 20-minute runtime, but when they do, it's all the more potent for it, with the repeated mantra of "Are you there?" running through it like a heartbeat pumping blood through the veins of our protagonist, who seems to be just on the verge of taming the beast inside himself. It's a beautiful moment of self-reflection that, in a narrative written by anyone other than Swans, would have made for a great ending. But this is a Swans record. You don't expect a happy ending, do you? The apostate drowns out any hope the preceding song built up before. From the opening siren's blare coming from the guitar, the chase is clearly on for our poor creature. At first, it feels almost militant in its cohesion, with a steady rhythm marching on and on and on, but as time goes on, it gets more and more deranged and chaotic, before ramping up into what feels like an actual full-on chase. We start to hear from the pursuer, but the lines start to get blurry, and it's unclear whether the protagonist is actually in any form of physical danger at all, or if he's allowed himself to fall to his own madness. The lyrics bubble and burst with "get out" and "not in my mind" over and over before devolving to "ladder to God," and then further into actual gibberish and obscenities. Is this a divine encounter? Is society going after our protagonist? Is he going after and destroying himself? Whatever the case, it all ends the same. Cries of anguish and primal hurt accompany drums which sound more like scattered gunshots than music, and all we're left with in the end, after this 2-hour journey we've taken, is a crumpled, broken body with nothing to show for itself. The Seer is dead. I don't think there's a better place to start when diving into the modern era of Swans, and, as the beginning of the trilogy, it will tell you pretty instantly if this is something you'll be able to stomach. As I said earlier, and especially with these records with massive sprawling runtimes, try to make time to really soak in and appreciate the intricacies of what's happening, but also don't let yourself get too caught up in the minutia to the point where you ignore what's important, the music itself. The second album in the trilogy, and by far the most legendary, is To Be Kind. Released to pretty much unanimous critical acclaim, including the elusive Fantano 10 out of 10, it very quickly gained classic post-rock status, and a full decade later, that reputation hasn't wavered even a little bit. Of every record the band ever released, I think this has proven to be the most common starting point. It was mine, and if I didn't feel so strongly about taking in the trilogy as a whole in order, then I would probably recommend the same. Nonetheless, here it is in the first segment as one of the most accessible albums in the discography. Now, accessible might seem like a weird descriptor here, especially to fans who already know the album, but hear me out here. For as long, as loud, and as aggressive as To Be Kind is, there's one word I would not use to describe it, and that's complex. In spite of the many layers of instrumentation and the multiple artistic voices on display, the music itself is so single-minded in its ambitions, and that is strictly to its benefit. There's a linearity to this music that even the narrative of the Seer doesn't have, where every track starts at a fixed point and gradually expands and escalates to a finality that sounds extremely different to the beginning, and is yet inescapably linked to that established DNA. And man, if you thought the Seer was groovy, well, you're right because it is, but with To Be Kind, almost all of the atmospheric elements are pushed to the side in favor of an almost unbearable amount of physicality. I have not once listened to this record without at least getting the uncontrollable urge to move my entire body in lockstep with the bass line one time. And to be honest, I would be surprised if it was even possible not to. Take the first track, Screenshot, which opens with an iconic repeating bass line which never wavers or alters for the duration of its 8 minutes. For half of that time, the tension builds and builds, the sinister groove making its way deeper into your head as Jura lists disconnected but no less evocative words in sequence as almost a form of sound poetry. That's another way in which this album differs from its predecessor, where the Seer had a very followable lyrical narrative. To Be Kind leans in the opposite direction, where instead it's the sound of the voice and the way that words manipulate and bend that voice that gives it power. After the first 4 or so minutes of the track, we finally reach the climax that the music has been so malevolently holding over our heads. It hits that peak, reaches its climax, and then it keeps going. And going. The climax builds even more and more and more, and you realize that this climax was not the peak of the song, but merely an elevation from which it finds more room to grow and expand. At only 8 minutes long, Screenshot isn't even one of the longer songs here, but even this feels like it will never end, and despite how linear the core idea is, it's impossible to predict how it will find more space to fill. It's exhausting, for lack of a better term for it. Just completely and utterly overwhelming, and as we reach into the tracks with double-digit minute counts, it never gets any easier to stomach. And yet, there's something so intoxicating about it. To hear something so visceral and so innately human, but to have it pushed to its limits over and over, well beyond the point you could even imagine for yourself. I would call the band geniuses if I wasn't so convinced that this came from a place much less intellectual and much more primal. You know that thing where if you take every artery and vein from just one human body, it would stretch around the entire world? That's what I envision To Be Kind as doing for rock music. Every fiber, every idea, every hook, every melody, every note, all of it is laid end to end and stretched until there is no further it could go, and only then is a track allowed to end. Every single pocket in this space will be filled, must be filled, before we can even think about the word closure. Some things take longer than others. The grimy bass line of A Little God in My Hands only contains enough stability to withstand 7 minutes of pummeling, whereas the 2-part devilry of Bring the Sun / Toussaint l'Ouverture needs all of 34 to fully break down both of its sides. Killing the first only leaves room for the second to rise from its ashes. This track in particular contains a contender for the most unhinged vocal performance of Jirah's entire career. There's arguments to be made for a fair bit of Swans' earliest material, but those at least felt like there was a degree of calculation involved. On Toussaint, it's random, it's violent, and it's completely deranged. It's amazing. Some Things We Do heralds the second half of the album, and in doing so solidifies the album's mission statement as a piece of raw, uncomplicated, uncompromisingly human art. We touch, we taste, we fuck, we love, we forget. For minutes on end, these things we do are all repeated over and over ad infinitum, or at least until the 5 minutes are over. With this short break done with, we're ready for disc 2, which opens with my favorite bass line on the entire record in She Loves Us. This quickly oscillating groove, which shifts constantly between two keys, comes so close to collapse multiple times before eventually giving in, leading to one of the few moments of aimless wandering, trying to find a direction before eventually locking into a simpler, more altered form of that same riff. This track is one where I can most easily hear the fact that there are two bassists playing simultaneously, as one maintains that all-important groove, while the other provides more various but no less cyclical flourishes to maintain momentum. If there's a song you know from this band's modern era, chances are pretty good that it's Oxygen, and that's not by accident. The track is one of the shortest from 2010's Swans, at a measly 8 minutes, and in an album that I already described as straightforward, this is definitely the most. What makes it so phenomenal, though, is how violent it is from front to back. It takes no time in getting you acquainted with its core riff, and even less time overwhelming that core riff with more and more and more until it's bursting to the seams with screams about stealing all the oxygen and horns blaring so violently it puts Danny Brown's Ain't It Funny to shame. I know I said earlier that this record puts atmosphere to the wayside, and compared to the Seer, and especially to the following Glowing Man, that is true, but that's not to say there's no room for it at all. I mentioned some of it in the super long track, which, if it had no atmosphere, would be utterly unbearable for that length of time, but the back half is where I think we finally start to see some of it shine through, particularly on the two tracks featuring backing vocals from St. Vincent, first titled Kristen Supine and then Natalie Neal. The former is as close to 90s Swans as the record gets, with that signature light organ and a vocal duo reminiscent of how Jarboe and Jirah used to sound, but with that To Be Kind twist of a pounding finality with a nearly industrial level of precision to its heaviness. The latter takes some time languishing in its soundscape before erupting into the most unrelenting drumline on the whole album, but what's interesting is the atmosphere isn't killed off, at least not for a while, as the build is not as rapid as the drums would lead you to believe, and in the end, we return to that same beauty from the beginning, dulcimer and everything. This leads us to the closer, which takes that liquid structure of the previous track's ending and draws out as far as it can go, just as every other track has, but in this case slower. The way the crash cymbals sweep across the mix, underpinning Jirah's drawl of "there are millions and millions of stars in your eyes," brings this sense of magnitude, which, even though it's not nearly as loud as the other peaks on this thing, feels no less impactful. The album closes, though, exactly how it always would, with cacophonous, rhythmic, abrasive pounding. The record, having stretched itself as thin as it can, is reduced to nothing but dust. To Be Kind is a special record in the band's discography, and in modern music generally, for its singular artistic vision, executed unfalteringly and unrelentingly over a more than 2-hour runtime. What makes it so impressive to me, beyond all of that though, is the fact that it never really feels its length. 2 hours is a very long time for an album, 3 times the average length, in fact. So, to maintain quality and vision across that time span is nothing short of incredible, not to mention that the band went and did it 4 more times. From the first seconds of The Glowing Man, you can tell this is going to be a whole different ordeal than the last two in the trilogy. Rather than the eerie rhythmic guitars or a sinister groove, the opening moments of this grand finale are subtle, a growing sensation manifested through the gradual build of a soundscape. Where To Be Kind was this landlocked, grounded, and visceral album, and the Seer remained somewhat ambivalent on the matter, going wherever its narrative led it, The Glowing Man pulls the series up to the skies and out into the far reaches of the universe, or perhaps the mind. It floats and wavers throughout, and while it still retains all the sonic elements that make up a modern Swans record, it has an extremely distinct aesthetic that is all its own. In a lot of ways, this is the most traditionally post-rock album the band has done, in terms of similarity to the other big names in the genre like Godspeed and Sigur Rós, but in truth, there's pretty much nothing that actually sounds like The Glowing Man, within or without the Swans discography. Prior to writing this video, this was by far the modern Swans record I had heard the least, mostly by virtue of the fact that it's the final part of an extremely long trilogy, so most of the time when I go to start the series, I end up fatigued by the time I reach this album. That doesn't quite check out though, because To Be Kind is probably my most listened to album overall. In all honesty, the reason is probably a combination of that, and also the fact that this is the least immediately gratifying trilogy album by a landslide. That may sound like a criticism, and honestly, a couple years ago I probably would have used it as one, but as time has gone on, I've given more and more time to The Glowing Man, and I've grown to appreciate that as its greatest strength. I've harped on it a lot thus far in the video, and I'm going to try and lay off on the point from here on out, but I have to emphasize that your first listen will almost certainly not be your best with this album. Give it time to ruminate and grow inside you. Learn to love all its little details. The first two tracks, The Cloud of Forgetting and The Cloud of Unknowing, make up nearly an entire album's worth of runtime together, and essentially capture what makes this such a beautiful piece of music, and also why it's more divisive than either of the others. These tracks are slow, long, and have very sparse rhythm throughout. The bass is still a majority of the rhythmic basis for these tracks, and the instrument that gets everything else from point A to B, but even that is less prominent and far more loosely knit than the rock-solid grooves of the previous album. The other thing listeners are likely to notice on these early tracks is that Jurah's vocals take prominence far more often than not, and not only that, but he is genuinely singing, and singing well. At the end of the day, it is still characterized by his very deep baritone voice, but within his limited range, he is exploring far more tonal space, reaching a lot further out of his usual octave than one might be accustomed to. Combine that with the fact that these are much more tangible and poetic lyrics than on To Be Kind, and we get probably the most Jurah-centric record of the trilogy. The musicianship here is by far the most subtle of any Swans record discussed here so far, with much of the instrumentation being comprised of sprawling drones that are kept engaging less by their groove and far more by the way each instrument, most of which I can't even properly identify while listening, ebbs and flows in relation to one another. One of the few instruments I'm able to properly identify is also one of the most unexpected, that being the very blatant use of synth on The World Looks Red and Black. It's this that makes me wonder how much of the other soundscapes are synthetic material, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter all that much when the result is this beautiful. Just like the rest of the trilogy, we get something of a strange interlude that leads us from CD 1 to CD 2, and here, I think it's particularly interesting because it directly brings us back to a 90s album I've already talked about today, and that's The Gread Annihilator. The track is People Like Us, and it contains by far the most traditional instrumentation on the entire record, with a very followable 4-on-the-floor beat and acoustic guitar with pretty much standard singing. I think it's interesting that this has been the through line across the trilogy, and that this final one takes the opportunity to look back on an era of their career otherwise completely disconnected from this one. The track also leads perfectly into what has always been one of my personal favorite tracks on this record, that being Frankie M, which starts its 20-minute runtime with some of the most enthralling and atmospheric drones and ambience the collective has ever arranged, with consuming cymbals, cacophonous screwdriver guitars, a very prominent organ dirge, and a sweeping chorus guiding us through this murky, unknown territory. It's this gradual building of incredible tension that allows the second half of the track to thrive in the way that it does, with unrelenting drums locking the previously aimless sound into a brutal cycle for minutes on end, with every chord change feeling like a shift in the world's foundation. I also particularly enjoy the way that this gives way, if only briefly, to pretty much the only genuine guitar riff on the whole album, and while it's still only 2 chords alternating back and forth, the subtlety in comparison to what has come before is a shock to the system, and leads perfectly into the more traditional song of the remaining minutes. We have to talk about the title track, which, while not the longest track in the band's career, is very possibly the best of their incredibly long songs. Following a beautiful duet with Jarrah's wife on When Will I Return, this 29-minute behemoth encapsulates just about everything that made this era of Swans so monumental for experimental and underground music. Every one of the dozen or so movements of this piece is utterly essential to the whole, and I feel as though the saying, greater than the sum of its parts, was specifically made to describe something like this. The track feels utterly massive, with some of the loudest and most brutal walls of noise the band's late career had, which is made all the more powerful by the fact that we haven't really gotten a ton of those leading up to this point in the album. What's more incredible, though, is the way this leads into one of the first major grooves on the album, and good lord, it is a good one. Had this appeared on To Be Kind, it probably would have been the best passage on that record, but because it's so unique on The Glowing Man, it's elevated just that extra bit to godlike territory. As a penultimate statement to the trilogy, I don't think you could ask for much more, and it really shows the mastery of this sound that the band had attained by this point. But it's not over yet. Finally, Peace is the title of the closing track, the closing statement of this 6-hour masterwork of a series, and I don't think I could possibly conceive of a more fitting way to end it out than this. Gorgeous pianos usher in what feels like an all-star cast of every possible collaborator they could have gotten access to. At least 4 people all singing together over lush but comparatively restrained instrumentation. This hypnotic closer emanates hope at the end of a series that has seemingly thrived on crushing hope out wherever it may appear. It's a beautiful look to the future, and for it to stick the landing like this without ever even hinting at cheesiness is nothing short of miraculous. At the end of it all, we are left with 3 of the most singular pieces of music the 2010s had to offer. The trilogy is a nearly incomprehensibly dense and masterful body of work that, had another band released it as their only material, it would still probably place them in the running for best discography ever. To have this show up nearly a dozen records into their catalog, one already filled with other masterpieces, is just phenomenal. There's no other word for it. These were the records I feared talking about most in this video, and considering I've spent about half an hour on just 3 out of more than 20 records is a little bit worrying, but I honestly don't think there was a quicker way to do these records justice. With all of these out of the way, though, we can finally go back to the pre-hiatus band and see what else Jarrah and co. were up to. Swans in the 80s was functionally a completely different band than Swans in the 90s or 2010s, and their debut album Filth is the most obvious example of that. Subtlety, beauty, melody, None of these things can be found on this record. Instead, it is sheer, unadulterated brutality for just under 40 minutes. You can describe and detail all the different elements that define no wave as a genre, but a much quicker and more efficient introduction to the scene would just simply to put this album on and show rather than tell. Jirah's description of the band's name was that swans are majestic, beautiful-looking creatures with really ugly temperaments, and I think the band might have missed the memo on that first part. But the latter aspect is here in spades as violent, brutal drums collide like a hammer to a skull, repeatedly, relentlessly for minutes on end. The bass being the most prominent melodic instrument in the mix, you would expect it to lend a sense of musicality to those disgraced rhythms, but in a twist I still don't fully comprehend. It instead somehow extracts melody, driving it impossibly into the negative. The influence of these rhythmic elements are palpable even in more popular spaces of music, the biggest of those being the early grunge scene. If you listen to Bleach, the first Nirvana album, you can hear so much of that drum sound bleeding into that record. Same with much of Sonic Youth's early material. So, if the prominent bass doesn't add any melody, surely the guitar must, right? Well, I mean, it does add notes, maybe? But listen for yourself, and I assure you, there's not a single riff, lick, or melody in sight. Noise rock is already known for atonal, abrasive guitar performances, but there's that, and then there's this sheer sonic barrage that far more often calls to mind the noise works of Merzbow and Garo Gary Gay 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 than it does post-punk of the era. It doesn't wholly rely on feedback. The strings are certainly being used, maybe even in a way that vaguely resembles how they're technically supposed to be, but the playing is so creative and unique that I really can't even compare it to anything, careening off the rails constantly, but somehow continuing to fall within that rigid framework provided by the tom-heavy drumming. As we've established early in this video, even in his most melodic moments, Jirah is, as a vocalist, not much of a musical singer, rather a textural and lyrical one. All hope then is gone for melody appearing on this record, but it's still worth bringing him up here as we see the beginnings of an era where Jirah is just about the most bestial and unrelenting vocalist in the New York City underground at the time, growling and shouting and roaring like a caged animal, screaming vitriolic screeds of misanthropy against man, society, and life itself. Use sex for control, use power for power, use hate for freedom, use money for cruelty. At every level of capitalist society, these statements, these commands hold true. At every level of capitalism, there is filth because there has to be. This filth is the caulking that keeps the bricks in place, the brutal rhythm that keeps the masses in step, the sewage that keeps the rats content, unquestioning their place in the sewers. The filth is all of us, for our complacence. The filth is every cog that turns without questioning its place in the machine. This debut is one of the most important rock records of the 80s, and holds up to this day as one of the most brutal and unique pieces of music you can hear. A far cry in a lot of ways from the sweeping atmospheric epics of the Trilogy more than 30 years later, but at the same time, it's not hard to see the aesthetic lineage, especially as we continue to fill the gaps in the discography.
Love will save you when the ocean splits itself into
Speaking of sweeping atmospheric epics, as well as gaps we've yet to fill in the discography, let's talk for a bit about the band's 1991 outing, White Light from the Mouth of Infinity. Just from looking at the album art, in contrast to the ones we've talked about before and since, it's pretty obvious that this is going to be a very different type of album from the rest. Where the rest of the album covers contain very clear and stark iconography, very simple in their composition and cleanly placed on top of blank or otherwise disconnected backgrounds, White Light's album cover is a total package, with the core focus being a much more complex and metaphorically rich image of a clothed bunny in a pool of blood holding a carrot. There's a full painting outside of this icon too, which gives context and a layered texture to the piece. I talk at such length about this album cover not only because I think it's beautiful, but because I think it's the perfect lens through which to view the contents of this album relative to the rest of the catalog. White Light is not the first Swans record to embrace folk music as a core influence. Children of God did it a little bit in the 80s, and there's another record we'll talk about later that more firmly cemented the shift into an acoustic direction, but for this record, it feels as though the project has found its footing in this sound, using it in a way that feels accurate to the genres and aesthetics from which it's pulling, but also somehow feels inarguably like a Swans album. Whether that be due to the dirty picked bass on the track You Know Nothing, the metaphysical lyrics about familiar themes like power, failure, time, and knowledge, or the inherent darkness belied by the beauty of the instrumentals. Where on Filth I challenged you to find a single melody throughout this album, here I would imagine it's impossible to go 5 seconds without at least 2 melodies appearing. It could be sweeping pianos and shimmering tambourines, or it could be twin acoustic guitars playing off each other like on Song for Dead Time, but whatever it is, it always promises to take your breath away. Another sound of this record that keeps it firmly recognizable as Swans is the way the drums feel on this thing. Listen to the opening instrumental to the track We Will Survive, and you'll be hit with this barrage of slow but absolutely gargantuan kick and snare patterns. The crash cymbal here makes up such an enormous part of the mix, it's as though any minuscule amount of low end in it was scooped up and dumped into the high register. And the cymbals are left to ring out much longer than you anticipate, giving this shimmering feel to all of the passages it's used on. Combine this with either the dungeon synth-esque organs on some tracks or the triangle and mandolin on others, and you get either the most ominous or most transcendent experience imaginable. The most quintessential piece of music on this record sits right dead in the center, and that's the gothic folk masterwork Love Will Save You. The post-punky dirge opens the track and maintains throughout every verse, massive drums, shrill, clean arpeggios from the guitars, and this incredibly distinct bass tone. I've seen it said that, had Ian Curtis lived into the 90s, this is what Joy Division would have ultimately ended up sounding like, and while I don't usually like to speculate about what-ifs like that, I can't argue the logic. Michael Gira here talks in a jaded way about all the ways love pushes you into and out of situations that you may or may not want to be involved in, but when he hits the refrain of, "But it won't save me," we're thrust into the most gorgeous instrumental passage on the whole album, with sweeping pianos and Jarboe lending sweet, multi-tracked vocals. The first refrain is rather tame, but as the track builds to its conclusion, the instrumentation gets more and more lush and driving. I've mentioned before that Gira is far from the greatest singer, a great and powerful vocalist, no doubt, but his singing voice is very limited, and the way he chooses to use it more often than not is amelodic and either spoken or shouted. Some of that speaking delivery appears on White Light for sure, just take the funeral-esque Failure, but a majority of the time we actually get to hear one of the few times Gira outright sings, and while for some it may be an acquired taste, I think his sense of melody and the way he integrates it into his limited range is quite beautiful, and his low register works as a great complement to the growl and groan of the bass guitar, and a stark contrast to the shimmering highs of much of the other instrumentation. If you need a break from brutality, or if you're a particularly avid fan of gothic or neofolk music, you owe it to yourself to give White Light a shot. Despite it not being a sound the band is all that well known for, they pull it off with masterful precision, and the result is one of the sleeper hits across their whole discography. This is where you go if the Gread Annihilator has been your favorite record so far. And now, with all of this prep work laid out, and with most of the band's many masterpieces out of the way, we're finally ready to tackle the biggest and boldest one of them all, 1996's Soundtracks for the Blind. I've talked about this album before on this channel in one of my very first videos, and to this day one of my most popular, but in the 2 years since I released that video, I've grown a lot as a person, as a Swans fan, and as a music critic. When I went into that review, I was scared. I didn't know what I was going to say or how to properly quantify an album of such magnitude, and even then I still hadn't wrapped my head around it. Now, revisiting all these years later, I'm excited to dig once again into what has grown to be a contender for my favorite album of all time, this time in the context of the entire discography that we've discussed to this point. Soundtracks sees the band at something of a breaking point. Swans had already gone through several different eras, each one acting as a dissolution point for the lineup in which many members would be cycled out and new ones would slot in to fill their roles or take up new roles that didn't exist in previous albums' sounds. With soundtracks, I think it's pretty clear that the member ready to cycle out was Michael Gira himself, who had already released his first solo record the year prior and was preparing to launch a new career with the band Angels of Light, which we'll get to later. While the project was obviously revived some 15 years later, at the time this was intended to be the final statement from the band, a monolithic statement of all that Swans had ever stood for and achieved. It's unclear what was recorded when, but rather than a traditional set of studio recording sessions, the band used this final opportunity to dig through piles of tracks left on the cutting room floor of the entire catalog and compile, remaster, re-record, and sequence them into this gargantuan testament to all that was and what could have been. This makes the record by far the band's most disjointed and esoteric, with no two tracks sounding the same back to back, and overall lacking a specific or coherent theme, but that is very clearly the point. Drones, noise rock, neo-folk, field recordings, and more show up throughout this thing, and while none of them are technically similar, by being presented in tandem and being interwoven in the way that they are, it maintains this very distinct aesthetic that ties it all into this unhinged and unrelenting package. This is an extremely dense album. It's not that much longer than any of the 3 albums in the trilogy, just by a handful of minutes, but with the variety of different sounds and ideas explored here, as well as the sheer depth of each of those 26 experiences, it can be a very difficult album to parse. Despite it being one of their most famous records, I put it so far down this list for a reason, because I think more than any other album in the history of the band, this one not only benefits from the context, but straight up requires it. Even with this context though, I'm sure some of you will still struggle to get a grip on this thing. My advice for anyone struggling with the structuring and pacing of this album would to be follow the directions right on the front of the CD. Treat it like a soundtrack to a movie that you can't see. Plenty of movies have cohesive soundtracks, sure, but a lot of them don't. A lot have a massive variety of sounds to help build their various moods and to backdrop different shots and scenes. Stripped of visuals, this film has so much more energy to devote to fleshing out its soundtrack, but it's a soundtrack nonetheless. With this in mind, the next step is to split this album into acts, which is made a bit easier by the fact that this album is split across 2 CDs, and then made even easier when you consider the real centerpieces of the album. 4 tracks here crack the 10-minute mark, and I consider these to be the key moments in the invisible film. Helpless Child comes first after a brief intro and opening credits over the haunting "I Was a Prisoner in Your Skull." Across Helpless Child's 16 minutes, it acts as the perfect inciting incident, and for a lot of people will likely also be the first moment of recognition because, despite its length, this is the song that by far has the most typical song structuring and instrumentation. If you've already heard the trilogy by this point, then you absolutely will recognize elements of this, in particular from The Glowing Man. This track doesn't explode or make much of a dramatic scene though. Instead, it bathes in its own atmosphere, as much slowcore as it is post-rock. Elements do build and climax eventually, which leads to the inciting incident of the whole album, which is the organ melody over the last few minutes of the track. It's a beauty that the next many tracks attempt to reclaim, but ultimately our protagonist falls deeper and deeper into the nightmare of this album. Between this inciting incident and our next key moment, Animus, we hear explorations of depravity of all sorts. Unsettling drones, horrifying noise rock, deeply disturbing house music, the introduction of a true villain, and a horrible look at the stakes of the story on how they suffer, which takes real interviews with Jiraz and Jarbo's father and mother respectively, the former about his developing blindness, and the latter on her fall to dementia. This leads us into Animus, which at first seems to be a reiteration of what Helpless Child was doing with slow guitars and light strings, but as we reach the second half of the track, a great cacophony of reverb, noise, drone, and pounding drums consumes the entire track, utterly eliminating any trace of that slowcore sound and leading us cleanly into Disc 2. From this point onward, I'm going to be a little less in-depth. This is a video convincing you to listen for yourself, after all. I don't want to spoil everything. But what's interesting about Disc 2 is how it imperfectly mirrors the first in these really bizarre ways. On the one hand, this is almost certainly the darker of the two halves of the album, but on the other, it contains a handful of the most acutely triumphant passages the band ever wrote. Tracks line up from disc to disc as well. For example, the two tracks where Jarbo is delivering some of the most terrifying, unhinged performances both fall on track 5, and then track 6 of both discs is where the phone sex operator appears, who I didn't mention before and will leave for you to discover. The final sacrifice comes around as the last climax of the album, and the stakes are just as high as the title implies. And at the end of the track, there is this genuinely jaw-dropping reveal, which isn't something you get to say very often about music. There is a couple of tracks that I imagine play over the credits, and then our story ends exactly as it began, in an all-consuming drone piece. Soundtracks for the Blind is important for so many reasons, and while it's far from the first album I'd recommend for a new Swans fan, I implore you to get to a point where you are adequately prepared to experience it in all its glory, because it's truly one of the most exciting and impressive feats in all of music history. Bands still borrow ideas from this thing almost 30 years after its initial release, and will likely continue to do so for 30 years more. This was supposed to be the band's swan song, pun intended, and while they did reform later, I can't think of a better way to cement a musical legacy. And now, the last record that I would consider absolutely essential is actually their most recent album at time of writing. The Beggar, released in 2023, is a record that, despite having nearly a full year to process it at this point, I still feel like I'm wrapping my head around it. It's so densely packed with details, musical and lyrical, that make every listen feel like uncovering different clues and opening a new latch on this mystery box of a record. This is the first Swans album rollout I've been fully here for, and of all the albums to be there when it dropped, discussing and theorizing with others about, I'm glad it was this one. I put this album last of all these essentials for two reasons. Firstly, because it's so new, we don't know how well it will stand the test of time, and while I personally think it's a masterpiece and that it will go down as a key moment in the band's long history, it's contentious enough now that I didn't feel comfortable touting it right from the get-go. Secondly, and much more importantly, I think that this album, even more so than Soundtracks, is an album that demands or at least massively benefits from a greater amount of context about the band's discography. Swans is a band that doesn't look back. They don't reuse or even reference their past material, so when they make exceptions like they do on this album, it's important to pay attention and see what's really going on. The Beggar was never supposed to be the band's final album. We know this for certain now that Jarrah has confirmed that they're already working on a follow-up. When the album came out, though, things weren't nearly so certain. With title tracks like Michael Is Done and the closure of a trilogy of songs that started all the way back in 1998, there were certainly signs that it could be. This, coupled with the fact that Jarrah was 69 years old, the same age that David Bowie was when he passed away in 2016, sparked some speculation that this could be the band's Black Star, a grand finale album about the artist's death that would inevitably coincide with the artist's passing. Thankfully, that's not what happened, and Jarrah seems to be alive and well, but one part of that theory did come true. This is an album about Jarrah dying. Swans' lyrics have never been particularly personal. Most of the time they aren't even literal in any real sense, but on The Beggar, we see Gerard writing by far the most direct lyrics from the most personal perspective we've seen yet from the band. At times reminiscent of the more straightforward nature of his other band Angels of Light, which we'll get to, this album is largely a first-person exploration of what it means to stare death right in the face, to have lived a long and fulfilling life, but to still not be ready for the inevitable. On The Beggar, your death is your final work of art, something that can be deprived of you at any time, and something that carries the existential weight of an entire lifetime behind it. This is not the final piece of art, but rather the reckoning with the fact that preparations need to be made, materials need to be gathered. The music is appropriately solemn and forlorn on this record, and it's one of the only albums I've ever heard that can even remotely approach the vibes and feelings created by soundtracks. Lone, droney, almost slowcore style guitar passages make up a majority of the instrumentation here, and where the bass was previously this ever-present and very aggressive groove machine, here it's substantially more ominous, acting as the unceasing march that forces every other instrument onwards against their will. The drums, a lot of the time, aren't even present, instead tying together with chimes and light cymbals. It means that when the drums do come in, you know that it's getting serious and that you need to pay attention, and it works every time. It's interesting, because this album still has just as many instrumentalists as any of their previous works in the trilogy, but the way they're used is way more sparse and atmospheric, where you've got this super lush and intricate and multifaceted mix that is utterly gorgeous and has so much more space to evolve because of just how many amazing musicians are behind it. Let's talk about the elephant in the room now. That end to a trilogy I alluded to earlier, that track is called The Beggar Lover, and it is almost 45 minutes long, closing out a trilogy of equally long songs throughout the band's career. The first part, released in '98, like I mentioned earlier, is The Body Lovers self-titled, not even a core Swans album. The second was a bonus track released on their 2010 album, and the final one is now here as the only installment found on an actual Swans release. The other two we'll talk about later, but for now, I want to talk about just this installment and how it works within the context of the album, as well as in the context of reunion-era Swans on the whole. This is, without a doubt, the most droney piece that has ever been released under the Swans name. Oftentimes missing any kind of rhythm or repetitive element, it languishes in its own creeping atmosphere, and a lot of the time, it's more of a sound collage than an actual musical piece. When it does build its instrumentation up, though, it's beyond anything I've ever heard. Seriously, the guitar tone that shows up in like the 17 to 20 minute range here is one of my favorite Swans moments, period. And what it peels back to reveal, namely this beautiful choir and then a rippling drone, is even better. The way this track ends is also the closest the band ever gets to true original post-rock, that jazzy style we saw on late-era Talk Talk, and I think the fact that they close on something so soft and subtle, rather than an explosion like earlier in the track, speaks volumes about where the band are right now creatively, and I love it. The Beggar is the final album that I would tell someone they absolutely have to hear if they're getting into Swans seriously, but that doesn't make it any less essential. It's a masterpiece of pacing, aesthetics, soundscapes, and dramatic theming that pushes the boundaries of Swans as a project into new territory not seen before, and acts as a fantastic cap-off to their career up to now. I can't wait to hear what they do next.
See that man, hey God.
Alright, so at this point, we're a bit over an hour into the video, and I haven't even gotten past the absolute most essential records, so let's pick up the pace and talk about some albums that might not be considered must-hears or anything, but are absolutely still worth your time, starting with the very first record they made after reuniting, My Father Will Guide Me Up a Rope to the Sky. In the decade plus between Swans' disbandment and reunion with this record, they had started to accumulate an even more rabid cult following than they ever did in the 80s and 90s. When Soundtracks for the Blind came out, there was only barely an internet, and the idea of getting your music online was still limited to the most tech-savvy among us. By this point in the new millennium, though, we were in the era of music blogs and iTunes, where you could realistically listen to just about anything you could find out existed at the push of a button. In an interview in 2006, Jarrah stated that Swans would absolutely never return, that he had more interesting things to do, which is why when in January of 2010, Jarrah made a blog post announcing the reforming of the band with members new and old, there was a fair amount of buzz. What would this look like? What could the band possibly have new to say if Jarrah had been so adamant before that he wasn't interested? 9 months later, we got the answer in the form of this relatively short and straightforward record, one that was met with warm but overall pretty confused reception, and given the circumstances, it's not hard to see why. The band's last statements before hiatus had been these massive, sprawling, and epic masterworks that pushed the boundaries of music itself, and almost 15 years later, all they had to show was this interesting but not particularly groundbreaking album. In retrospect, however, I think people were a little too hasty to pass judgment on the reunion, and now that we know where the band would go next, I think this album has actually aged phenomenally. My Father is an album that bridges the gap cleanly between Jarrah's band Angels of Light and the Trilogy era Swans. We can hear elements that are present all throughout the Seer and To Be Kind on here, but they're filtered through a much more folky lens and reserved to these much shorter, more concise song structures. The first track, No Words, No Thoughts, almost hits 10 minutes and is definitely my favorite song on the album, but beyond that, not a single track reaches the 7-minute mark, which is nothing short of bizarre in the context of the trilogy that followed, and at a mere 44 minutes, it can feel like a teaser EP in comparison to the monoliths that followed. But I think this brevity actually acts greatly to its benefit because this is a very clearly and tightly edited album. There's not a single moment that doesn't feel meticulously crafted to fit into place, and while the result is an album that might not leave the same immense impact as some of their other works, as a bite-sized taste of 2010s era Swans that you can listen to without setting aside a whole afternoon, I have nothing but love for it, and with highlights like Jim, You Fucking People Make Me Sick, and Eat in Prison, you'd be a fool to dismiss it as a low point in their career. Now for another fairly overlooked and underappreciated album in Swans' catalog, Leaving Meaning dropped in 2019, and for the first time in 7 years, a Swans record was met with something other than universal acclaim. That's not to say it was hated, plenty of people enjoyed it, and I didn't see anyone actively negative towards it, but when the big question was, what will Swans do to follow up their grandest achievement, this was not what people necessarily wanted to hear as an answer. Just like with My Father, though, I think the burden of expectation is the only reason this is seen as a lower point in their career. Leaving Meaning, while clearly not their best album ever, is still a very worthwhile addition to their catalog, and feels like the modern answer to the 90s lineup's neo-folk era in a lot of ways. There are moments of bombast here, it is a modern Swans record after all, but the vast majority of this record is airy, atmospheric, and lush to no end. This is about as close a record as I could imagine to what Swans Unplugged would sound like, with most of these songs centering around Jarrah and his acoustic guitar, with everything else there to build up the mood and tone. In that sense, it definitely feels like a prototype of what The Beggar would ultimately master 4 years later, but Leaving Meaning has a few unique tricks up its sleeve. Most notable of these, to me, is the way this record uses vocal layering. Jarrah is not the only singer here, much of his voice is backed by soft choirs, or is even outright replaced by someone else, like on the track The Nub. When the vocals are just Jarrah's, we often hear them being doubled up and multiplied over themselves, sometimes to build dramatic tension and sonic space, and occasionally, like on the closer, to cause utter sonic chaos and unease. While the lyrics here are less personal and intimate than those on The Beggar, This was still very clearly the most lyrics-driven reunion album to this point, and the visuals they evoke are some of the most vivid across their whole career. On the whole, this is definitely a bit overlong, and some editing could have been done to the track list to get it to flow better as a whole piece, but I think as a precursor to The Beggar, and as a transitional period for the band, it could have been a lot worse, and overall, I still consider this to be a pretty underrated Swans record. If you've avoided it up to now, but enjoy some of the band's more acoustic works in the 90s, absolutely give it a go. Taking it all the way back to the 80s, and on the topic of underrated albums, I want to talk to you about what is, in my opinion, by far the most underrated record in their entire catalog, Cop. While their debut record preceding this gets all the acclaim as one of the most brutal and unrelentingly heavy albums in rock history, it's that album's little brother that has always struck me as more impressive. Perhaps it's the novelty factor that makes Filth the more appealing choice. It is true that nothing really sounded like that album when it came out, but in my opinion, Cop is a refinement and improvement over that formula in basically every way. I'll put this out here now. If you found Filth to be too abrasive or violent for your taste, turn back now because Cop will not appeal to you. But if you, like me, found Filth to be an amazing proof of concept that you wanted to see dialed even further into inaccessible territory, complete with abjectly horrifying noise and industrial elements and an apathetic political skew to back it up, you may have found your new favorite Swans record. This thing is possibly the most nihilistic, hateful album you'll ever hear, with not a single moment of clarity or respite from the 40-minute alleyway beatdown that is this album. Tempos are slower, and generally the songs are less outright aggressive than on Filth, but the violence is cranked up to 11, and the result is a slow, unrelenting, inescapable mutilation of the senses. To think that Godflesh wouldn't release Street Cleaner for another 5 years after this is incredible, because that same brand of looming, lethargic pummeling is so present here. I talked before about the guitar noise on Filth, and that record's guitar is still wildly impressive to me, but there's something about the way this record's noise just completely lies in the background, no less abrasive, that speaks to me. The bass and drums coldly and cruelly bash your head in, and that guitar noise is the ringing in your ears between every hit. And we can't talk about this record, especially considering the violent imagery I've painted up to now, without talking about the title. Cop. Stark, simple, and utterly horrifying to anyone who has ever lived under threat of extrajudicial violence. The title track's lyrics say it better than I ever could. The punishment fits the crime. Nothing beats mutilation. Humiliation's a disease. Nothing beats humiliation. Nothing beats them like a cop with a club. Nothing beats them like a cop in jail. This angle puts everything into such a stark and uncomfortable perspective that, for me, elevates what was already a sonically impressive piece of work into the realm of artistic masterpiece. It's not the kind of thing many, or even most of you, are likely to enjoy, but for me, this is their best no-wave work, and it's not even particularly close. I've combined these next two records together, both for the sake of my time and also because they are so obviously sister albums that it only made sense. Greed and Holy Money, released just a month apart in 1986, are the final two albums the band did in their original no-wave sound, and while they are definitely still tied to a lot of the same musical elements of records preceding, these two albums carry a much different aesthetic and tonal weight to them. Pretty much gone are the passages of guitar noise and really any noise whatsoever. Instead, the mix is completely pristine and calculated, giving much more emphasis to the absolutely massive drums. These albums are brutal in a very different way to Filth and Cop because there's no pretense for the brutality. It's completely raw and unfiltered with little to nothing to distract from just the pounding rhythms. The atmosphere here is aided by the introduction, for the first time, of pianos to the Swans sound. Having just heard Cop, you might be confused or even upset to hear that, but I promise when you hear it in the context of the record, it will all make sense. This is not a twinkly, melodic piano you might envision. Rather, this is a low-down, bassy piano that is barely in tune and hitting notes a bass guitar wouldn't even attempt. It's very cold and mechanical too, tying in neatly with the rhythmic elements here. Jura is a lot less manic as well, with subdued performances uplifting the other new addition to the sound, that being the first performances from Jarboe on any Swans record. Jarboe here is used sparsely but effectively, first as backing on Gread, and then getting a whole short song to herself on Holy Money. She would obviously be utilized to greater effect on the following Children of God, but it's good to see her here. Overall, these records are both very good, if a little redundant, because not only do I prefer the two records before them, but a majority of the tracks on these records are done better on another live record that we'll get to down the line. Regardless, these albums are important to the evolution of the band and are always worth a look, even if you only see them as a step towards a better direction. Now we're finally coming up on the end of the studio works, but we've still got a fair ways to go, so let's get right into a couple of albums and EPs that you don't necessarily need to listen to, but, as is the case with everything in this discography, is still worth checking out at one point, starting with their 1989 album, The Burning World. The Burning World is a strange album for Swans. Following up Children of God was always going to be a difficult thing given the perfection with which that album balanced their heavy sound and their newfound knack for atmosphere. With The Burning World, the band seemingly eschews any kind of heft and fully embraces the folkier, gothic instrumentation that showed up on tracks like In My Garden and You're Not Real Girl. The result is basically the band's sellout album, and one that is pretty commonly regarded as one of the band's weakest, to the point where Jura himself has talked about being embarrassed by it and has never put it up on any kind of streaming platform. I will go out on a limb here and say, though, that this is a pretty underrated album in the catalog. Sure, it's not as dynamic or musically revolutionary as their albums prior, and doesn't have the same depth that their later folk-adjacent albums would, but there's still something to this simplicity that works so well for me, be it the way that Jarboe's voice floats over the country-inspired fiddles and strings, or the more grounded and deep-sung vocals from Jura over rootsier acoustic instruments. There's a pervasive beauty across this whole album, and while some songs are better than others, the songs that are great are absolutely fantastic. The opening two tracks, especially Let It Come Down, are great examples of how this more gothic sound would work for the band going forward, and the closer, Goddamn the Sun, is genuinely one of the best songs the band ever did, and it's a shame it gets so overlooked by virtue of its attachment to this record. Not technically attached to this album is a single that I also want to mention, which is two different covers of Joy Division's Love Will Tear Us Apart. I mentioned earlier that people speculate that 90s Swans is what Joy Division would sound like had Ian Curtis not passed, and this is the best evidence of that. Swans would rework this sound into one of their best records just 2 years later, and I would recommend people listen to that first, but if you're curious as to the origins of their more acoustic-driven sound, I hope you won't ignore The Burning World. The other slice of bread in the White Light sandwich, and that record's sister album, Love of Life, is also a pretty commonly overlooked album for the same reason that The Burning World is. It's just not as amazing as White Light. The direct comparison here, what with the similar album cover and the fact that these albums are frequently bundled together, actually does more of a disservice to this record than the one preceding, because it's set up so explicitly to be a follow-up, and it just doesn't quite measure up. That said, measuring up to White Light from the Mouth of Infinity is a task that I don't think a good 95% of any music is up to, so measuring it in those terms feels pretty unfair. Realistically, this is still an excellent album and a great addition to the band's catalog. In terms of similarities to its predecessor, it still maintains the exact same palette of instrumentation and keeps a lot of the same lyrical aesthetics, but I find this record to be a lot more dirgy and hefty, with bigger drum sounds and a very prominent bass mix. I love the way the synth organs sound on this thing. It feels like a great through line to some of the 80s neoclassical darkwave stuff that was happening around this time, like Dead Can Dance and Black Tape for a Blue Girl. The other major difference is that this is the first album the band made that heavily uses spoken word and field recording samples, specifically on its 6 untitled interludes. This isn't something they would use so prominently in the future, aside from soundtracks, but considering how much that album's use of them influenced bands like Godspeed, it's fascinating to see the origins here. On the whole, the record doesn't maintain the same momentum as its older sister. Some of the later tracks do fail to stir up the same feelings as their best, but some of their greatest tracks ever do appear here, notably the first 2 tracks, which set the tone perfectly, and Amnesia, which is by far the heaviest thing here, and feels so panicked in its intensity and speed. Love of Life is a record I don't come back to very often in favor of its surrounding works, but I think you'd be remiss to write it off entirely. If White Light is one of your favorites so far, you do owe it to yourself to give it a go. Now let's talk about our first EP, and also the band's first EP, the self-titled, released in 1982. Coming a year before Filth, this thing is really interesting to behold because while it is definitely still a no-wave album, it kind of sounds nothing like anything else the band did after. Rather than the lurching, noisy sound of Filth and Cop, or the sparse and unrelenting coldness of Greed and Holy Money, this thing has very busy, bass guitar heavy instrumentation, a very quiet guitar mix, more punk adjacent vocals, and the first, and to my memory only, inclusion of a saxophone player on a Swans record. It's the most post-punk of any early Swans release, and at less than 20 minutes, this sound never overstays its welcome. If you're looking for another angle of early no-wave, give it a go. It can be found pretty easily on YouTube. If you want their more typical no-wave sound, look no further than these 2 EPs that showed up during their 2 respective early eras. Young God, released alongside Cop in 1984, and essentially is a raw, less developed version of that deranged, drony, bitingly political noise wave sound that I love so much. A Screw, on the other hand, is from the same time frame as Greed and Holy Money, and contains 2 different versions of the unhinged titular track, as well as an early, very different version of Blackmail, which would later appear on Children of God. Both of these EPs are largely inessential, but considering the fact that I've been pretty much unable to find anything that sounds quite like either of these eras of the band, they do a little bit to fill that void if you've got it. The last main EP comes a fair bit later in the band's career, the end of their original run in fact. Die Tür ist zu, which is German for The Door is Closed, is a very strange and interesting release. Coming about 4 months before Soundtracks for the Blind, it's something of a promotional teaser for that album released for German audiences, and it's got 2 main gimmicks. The first is that this is basically a condensed version of the entire album, blending and alluding to tracks from all throughout the main track list in a much briefer 54 minutes. That's still very long for an EP, but considering it's less than half the original runtime, it's incredibly impressive. Not all of these tracks are as they appear on Soundtracks. YRP is a much rawer live mix, which I think I actually prefer to the original, and M/F is a fully acoustic version, which is somehow even more jarring and unsettling. The other major difference here is that Michael Gira is singing almost entirely in German on this thing, which might not sound like a big deal, but somehow it adds this whole different layer of mystique and unsettling discomfort to the ordeal, especially on the rendition of Helpless Child, which is here titled Hilfos Kind. On the whole, I obviously can't call this an essential piece of the Swans canon. It's pretty much just all alternate takes and blended versions of existing songs. But for what it is, it's absolutely phenomenal, and I am glad to own it. If you're this far in and somehow still needs selling on soundtracks, feel free to give this thing a listen. It's great. Taking it back again to the 80s for one last time in this segment, we've got Body to Body, Job to Job, which is, as stated on the cover, a collection of 16-track recordings, previously unavailable 24-track studio recordings, live cassette recordings, and sound loops from the years 1982 to 1985. This is the deep cut of all the deep cuts, containing the rawest studio material you're ever going to hear from the band. And while there's obviously good reason for a lot of this not to have made the cut for albums, and the production values are all over the place, there's some gems in here for sure. A personal favorite of mine is track 4, Your Game, which has this super propulsive drum rhythm over guitar noise and a really haunting spoken word segment that consumes the whole mix. It's dirty, it's raw, and it's absolutely fantastic. You'll also get some really early mixes and arrangements of tracks off the first 2 records, like Cop and Half-Life, which sound even more bestial than ever. There's also the 3 loop tracks here, which are exactly what they say, just these raw, short, ambient tape loops that cycle and warp, giving a weird sense of pace and atmosphere to this otherwise intentionally disjointed compilation. If you love Filth, and especially if you love Cop like I do, you should at least skim this thing for hidden gems. This is the first and only set of things in this section attached to the post-reunion era of Swans, which I think is a testament to just how tight and intentional the band has kept their image and art this past decade and a half. The 2 recordings that I want to shout out here, though, are What Is This and Is There Really a Mind, both of which accompany Leaving Meaning and The Beggar, respectively. Essentially, these are fundraising albums, the proceeds of which go towards the recording costs of their upcoming studio counterparts. Not only are these for just the diehards, they're also specifically for diehard fans of those particular albums, as these are all incredibly rough and unfinished fragments that we now have proper recordings available of. It's all just Michael Gira singing solo acoustic, which works for some songs and doesn't for others. The only track I really recommend seeking out is the version of No More of This from Is There Really a Mind, which was already a pretty stripped back track, but in this context it gains a new level of lo-fi beauty. The rest is pretty take or leave, but still interesting and a pretty cool way of kickstarting your project when you've got an audience as avid as theirs. Now, normally for live albums, I would be fine to just briefly skim over some highlights and call it a day, but this is Swans we're talking about, and in this case, the live albums are just as important as the studio albums, and in some cases, maybe even more so. Swans Live is a completely different thing. The volume and scale is given so much more room to breathe than in a studio setting, and it's where the songs are made and evolve. A lot of the time listening to live recordings, you can hear tracks that feel like a midway point between 2 songs in their career, where one song gradually turned into a new one over the course of a tour. There's a lot of ground to cover in terms of live albums, so I'm first going to give you 3 essential live albums, and then the rest I'm going to put in chronological order afterwards, just to briefly mention. What a title, eh? The first essential live album is also the first the band ever put out, releasing in 1986, the end of the Gread and Holy Money tour. I've talked about those earlier and probably give off the impression that I'm relatively cool on them compared to the other no wave material, and that's true, but I think a massive part of that is just the fact that nearly every single track on those records is done better on this live album. For nearly 80 minutes, this thing drones and plods its way through these previously sparse and pristine tracks, dragged out to excruciating lengths and melted to their purest essence, and then expanding from that into some of the most unrelentingly heavy and brutal sounds ever put to tape. Take the second track, Fool, for example. Already by far my favorite track on Gread. By giving it an extra 3 minutes to really smother you in atmosphere, it gains a whole new dimension of horror that was missing from the studio recording. A Screw has this anxiety-inducing drum intro that feels like it's never gonna end for more than a minute straight before Jirah comes in screaming, and eventually we start to get bass and the noisiest guitar tone known to man. Greed and Holy Money had some of the sharpest, cleanest production in the whole catalog, but here, all of that is thrown out, and I think these tracks are made so much better for it. Stupid Child sounds like the atomic apocalypse, A Hanging sounds like a genuine horror movie scene, and this recording of Coward honestly feels like it would be the best single moment of any other band's career, but because it's Swans, it might not even crack top 5. If you're prepared for one of the most exhausting, headache-inducing, incredible things you've ever heard, I can't recommend this enough. I would even say you could skip Greed and Holy Money altogether and just listen to this instead. The second Essential live album, and probably the most unanimously agreed upon as their best, is Swans Are Dead. Once again, what a title, and an accurate one in this case, as it would be their final release for over a decade. This 2-CD set contains 2 live performances, with no repeat songs, allowing for one seamless listening experience over the span of nearly 2.5 hours. The first disc, which represents the black circle on the cover, is the band's very last performance in 1997. It contains some of the widest variety of album representation of almost any live record in their career, with tracks off soundtracks, Gread Annihilator, Love of Life, even as far back as the Young God EP, albeit a very heavily altered and evolved version of the track I Crawled. That's not to mention the 3 original tracks that open the record, tracks that to this day have never and likely will never be released in any studio capacity. These songs are absolutely phenomenal, and while there's obviously no world in which Swans did not disband when they did, it's still fascinating to imagine a world where the band took the direction that these massive songs hint at. Feel Happiness in particular is one of the best songs the band ever did, without question, and even if you don't have time to get through this whole behemoth of a record, you should probably listen to it. The second disc, the white CD, represented by The Border on the album cover, is from an earlier tour, one in 1995, immediately before Soundtracks was released. It's made up almost entirely of songs from that album, and is the closest any of us are likely to ever be to hearing those songs performed. Comparing these live performances to their studio recordings is pretty pointless, as they are both perfect in every single case for different reasons. But some standouts here are the interesting way Final Sacrifice sets up the tone as an opener rather than closes it. The deranged energy I See Them All Lined Up brings to an otherwise more subdued horror, and the performance of Helpless Child, which is at time of writing probably the best thing the band has ever recorded, point blank period. I love live albums, as you're likely to know if you've seen any of my other Let's Get You Intos, and Swans Are Dead is without a doubt a contender for the very best live album ever released. Just as essential as anything in the actual essentials category earlier, you owe it to yourself to hear this. The last of my quote-unquote essential live albums comes in the form of their most recent, that being 2017's Deliquescence. The culmination of half of a decade of careful and deliberate work, this record feels like an exhuming of every single bit of genius the band had buried for themselves to find later. Every track, be it renditions of songs off To Be Kind and The Glowing Man, or pieces that never saw the light of day in any other form than this, are intricately crafted and executed with the precision of a surgeon and the ethos of a jackhammer. The album tracks are unequivocally better than their studio counterparts, and the original tracks are up there with the best songs the band ever made. In particular, and this will be the obvious standout to anyone who listens to this, the opening track, The Knot, which was a live staple at the time, is just absolutely untouchable. At over 45 minutes in length, it is still the longest piece they've ever composed, even after The Beggar Lover, and not a second of that time is wasted. It grows and shifts and explodes in all the ways you'd want it to, and the recording is so crisp it puts most studio records from other bands to shame. Beyond that, Cloud of Unknowing is enormous, given an extra 5 minutes to breathe and a few massive changes to its structure, and The Glowing Man's title track is possibly the best Jarrah vocal performance I've ever heard. The album The Glowing Man may have been the end of the trilogy, but Deliquescence marks the end of an era, and it's the perfect end to a perfect era. From here, to save time, I'm going to go ahead and do a bit of a lightning round, going through all the remaining live albums quickly in chronological order based on when they were recorded, starting with Real Love. This is from the same tour as Public Castration, and while it isn't nearly as good as that one, mostly due to the fact that they hadn't started expanding the tracks for the live setting like they would later, this quick burst of lethargic grime is still worth checking out for a great rendition of Money is Flesh. Next, recorded in 1987, is Feel Good Now, the live album for the Children of God tour. There's two different versions of this, the original and the abridged version available on streaming, and this will be the only time I ever say this about anything, but I actually like the streaming track list a lot more than the original. The original list is packed to the brim with so much needless excess, lots of random spoken word and interstitial nonsense recordings that absolutely brutalize the pacing. The version on Spotify, which has just been reissued, is actually a bit of a sleeper hit record, containing some fantastic renditions of some of the band's best songs, including an absurd 18-minute version of Blind Love, which works way better than it has any business doing. This is also notable for being the earliest recording we have of Jarboe's live vocals with the band on Blackmail, and as expected, she holds up fantastically. From that same tour, we have Kill the Child, which compiles performances between 1985 and 1987 into one suite to varying degrees of success. The biggest issue here is that on the CD, which is the only way to listen to this thing, the whole thing is presented as 1 hour-long track, despite the fact that these recordings don't transition to each other particularly cleanly. The recording quality can vary pretty wildly from moment to moment, and the presentation generally is not the best, but if you can get past some of these hurdles, you will find a handful of tracks that actually surpass their performances on Feel Good Now. This thing is way, way heavier and louder than that record, feeling like a look into the transition between two eras, and the crappy production values actually sell this a lot. Not an essential by any means, but not worth ignoring either. Next, from the tour leading up to and directly following The Burning World, we have Anonymous Bodies in an Empty Room. This one is a bit of an anomaly for a few reasons, and ultimately I wouldn't recommend going through the effort to track it down, but it's still worth talking about here. Obviously, The Burning World was an interesting time for the band, as they had fully transitioned out of their heavy music era into more traditional goth music, and here you can hear honestly pretty great performances of that material that feel a lot more weighty than in the studio, or they would at least if they were recorded to any kind of standard, but unfortunately this is little more than an officially sanctioned bootleg, with audio quality that a lot of the time completely tarnishes the experience. I'm glad some kind of preservation of this era exists, but I wish it was a better example. Just a couple years later, recorded in 1992, we have Omniscience, which fixes just about every issue I mentioned before, this time covering material from White Light and Love of Life. Both the recording quality and the material itself are so much clearer and more impressive than the last live album, and we get a much more immersive view into what that era of the band felt like. This, in a weird way, feels like the band's first foray into post-rock, with many of these songs building and expanding well beyond the scope of their original recordings, similarly to how Greed and Holy Money's tracks were built out and evolved on Public Castration. The difference here is that White Light and Love of Life are such densely arranged albums in comparison, so the result is this absolutely massive and intricate sound that rivals that of their later records. There's not been any kind of reissue of this since its original CD release, but with the recent repressing of other older live material, one can only hope. Until then, I do highly recommend seeking this out for one of the most unique experiences in the live catalog. That's it until 2 whole decades later, when we have the first post-reunion live album, We Rose From Your Bed with the Sun in Our Head. Each of the live albums since the reunion have coincided with a studio record, and this is the one released after My Father. For this tour, the band was still doing a lot of work trying to figure out what Swans meant in the 21st century, and as such, there's a lot of different experimentation with structures, and especially there's a lot more pieces from old Swans here, especially off of Children of God with Sex, God, Sex, and Beautiful Child. Here we also get to see songs from the Seer in their very earliest formative states, including the title track and The Apostate. This is a great midway point for those curious what the band sounded like when they were still finding their feet again, and absolutely worth seeking out. Then, for the Seer tour, we have Not Here, Not Now. Not too much more to say here other than the fact that, once again, it's very interesting to see tracks off of To Be Kind in such a formative state. Bring the Sun / Toussaint Louverture, in particular, is so interesting to behold as it evolves directly from the title track to the Seer and has elements from all throughout that record, notably the gunfire drums from Apostate. Another very cool live album. Finally, for the To Be Kind tour, we have The Gate, which is probably the best of all of them if you discount Deliquescence, which I consider to be on a whole different level. It opens with an early rendition of Frankie M off the upcoming Glowing Man, and it honestly might be better than the original. You can really see how that track's groove evolved right out of some of the more rhythmic stuff on To Be Kind. Then we get some awesome performances of key To Be Kind tracks and more upcoming tracks like Cloud of Forgetting and Unforming. The big highlight here is the closer, though, which sees a now completed version of Bring the Sun transitioning once again into another new piece, one of their best pieces ever, The Glowing Man. Here it's titled Black-Eyed Man and has incomplete lyrics, but the core of the song is still there and it's amazing, and even more punishing than its studio counterpart. This is the band on the cusp of their greatest form, which they'd achieved just 2 years later, and is one of the most impressive live achievements the band ever had. And with all of that, we've done it. We've made it through every Swans record, old and new, kind of. See, the thing with Swans is that the only through line lineup-wise is Michael Gira, so while he might not have made anything else under that moniker, there's still plenty of other stuff he's done, especially during Swans' hiatus. I'm going to be super brief here in discussing them, mostly just to inform as to what is out there and let you go down your own rabbit holes. But for the most part, I think these are all at least good projects, with some of them being great or absolutely fantastic. On the absolutely fantastic side of things, we have the most famous non-Swans Gira project, one I've mentioned a few times already, Angels of Light, who specifically mastered their sound on How I Loved You, which is basically like if Swans continued in the direction of Burning World and White Light and added even more folk and country elements in. It's a romantic, melancholy work of masterpiece that, if it were a mainline Swans release, would very likely rank in my top 5 records they ever did. Their other records are also great for the most part, with the more classically neo-folk New Mother and their final record, We Are Him, being other highlights in the project's history. The next project is the one by far the most connected to Swans, and that's The Body Lovers. Coming directly after Soundtracks for the Blind, this project's debut record, number 1 of 3, feels like a direct evolution of the most experimental and inaccessible elements of that record. A 73-minute drone piece with brief glimpses of post-rock, industrial, sound collage, and noise, this project is absolutely unmissable if you're into more esoteric and experimental music. The reason I say it's the most connected to the band is more than just sonically though. Think back to Swans' most recent album and you'll remember that the long song on that record is called The Beggar Lover 3. Well, this is 1. Part 2 is an actual Swans track, and I've saved it for now so I can talk about it in relation to Body Lovers. Released in 2010 as a bonus disc on the tour exclusive CD of My Father Will Guide Me, Look at Me Go is probably my favorite of the 3, and it's by far the hardest to come across. Taking all of what would eventually make the trilogy tick and condensing it into a 46-minute behemoth of drone and noise, this thing is far more rhythmic than any other installment in this trilogy, and contains the most nuanced structuring and pacing of the 3 in my opinion. This video is obviously more focused on people who are new to the band and want a place to start, but if there's one thing I can leave people who are already fans of the band, it's to please seek this track out. You will not regret it. Another band worth checking out, one very connected to Swans, is Skin. Operating between 1986 and 1990, they're probably most known for their compilation The World of Skin, which for the longest time appeared as part of a compilation which was the only way you could listen to Children of God on streaming. It's basically just a darkwave and neo-folk duo consisting of Jira and Jarboe, and yeah, it sure sounds like Swans. There's good stuff on here, some great stuff even, and it's cool to hear Jarboe take a much more prominent role on their first album, but by album 2 it seems as though Michael had taken over, and I find these tracks much less interesting. Their last album, 10 Songs for Another World, is probably their strongest release, as it cleanly balances both front people for a record much more nuanced and enjoyable than the 2 before them. If you wanted to know what Jira was up to before starting Swans, there's not much, but we do have this band Circus Mort, who released one EP back in 1981 and then disbanded very soon after. It's not particularly amazing, but it's very interesting to see an in-progress version of what would soon be the no wave that Filth embraced. This is definitely still post-punk, but there's an edge and an angst to it that puts it in stark contrast to other bands of the time, and hearing Gerard's voice so young is really cool as well. They also make really prominent use of a keyboard synth, which is very different and at times awesome, but other times just silly. Worth giving a shot if you're into 80s underground stuff, but don't expect a level of artistic mastery similar to what we'd see a couple years down the line. Continuing to follow Jira for one more album, you'd think an artist like this would have a bunch of solo material floating around, but aside from some random minor collaborations, all we have is this one album, Drainland. Stripped back and acoustic for a majority of its runtime, this record coincides with the release of The Gread Annihilator and seems like a way for Jira to keep one toe in the neo-folk pool while Swans moved into a new direction once again. There's some weird stuff on this too, like a pretty obnoxious version of I See Them All Lined Up and a super noisy version of Low Life Form, as well as the best rendition of Blind ever. Give this a peep for curiosity's sake, and definitely listen to the first and last tracks, but don't anticipate something particularly consistent or mind-blowing. Where Jira only had one solo album to speak of, Jarboe has too many to count, and God knows I have no interest in diving into all 40 plus of them now. I will, however, shout out a couple I think are worth a look. 13 Masks, her first, is this absolutely bonkers experimental rock record released in 1991, which feels almost predictive of the weird places 90s alternative rock would go, although substantially more eccentric and freaky than anything that would chart later in the decade. Sacrificial Cake, released 4 years later, is quite the opposite, diving instead into dark ambient style darkwave music that looms and wafts around you for its entire runtime. Far less experimental than its predecessor, but also far more palatable. And then, jumping ahead almost a decade, I want to shout out the collaborative record she released in 2003 with sludge metal band Neurosis, which is, naturally, the heaviest record I've ever heard her as a part of. This thing is massive, experimental, well beyond anything Neurosis ever did alone, and Jarboe's vocals work wonders on this sound. Considering the things that have come out about Neurosis' regular vocalist Scott Kelly in recent years, my vote is that the band get back with Jarboe as their main singer going forward, but that's just me. And with that, I think I've said everything I want to about Swans for right now. This is a band that means a lot to me. I've been listening to them pretty much as long as I've been taking music seriously, and when I made that very first Let's Get You Into video 3 years ago now, this was the band I always wanted to cover in the series but never had the time to. I hope you've all enjoyed. I hope if you weren't into the band already, you have more interest than you did before, and I hope if you were already into the band, you learned something new or gained some new perspective on projects you might not have considered as deeply before. I have no idea if I will ever tackle a project this massive again. It's not likely, so relish it while you can. I love this video, and I hope you all have as well. Thank you, as always, to my friends who support me on Patreon. Your names should be on the screen right now. You are the reason I feel like I can do this, and a project of this magnitude would never have even crossed my mind as a possibility without your support. If you'd like to help me out where you can go over and toss me a couple bucks a month, and you'll get access to the Discord, where you can chat with me and other fans of my stuff. We're always talking about something interesting there, so you're missing out if you don't. I'll also be releasing an unscripted companion video in which I review the 2019 documentary about the band Where Does a Body End, which, at time of reading this, I have not seen it, so if you want even more Swans content from me, go check it out. I also want to shout out my friends Harry and Evan, who I've been co-hosting the Modulation podcast with. Since releasing my last video, we've made our Album of the Year list, and by the time this is out, at least 2 new episodes going over some of the hottest and most interesting new releases of the year so far, so go ahead and give them some love too. As some of you have noticed, I've also started doing individual album reviews via shorts here, so check those out as you see them, I guess, or you can follow me on TikTok and Instagram where I'll post them as well. Those links will be in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time with Mucore 4.